Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the self-titled debut album from Hozier. But first, let's talk about religion. Now, as I mentioned in the past, I'm Catholic, mostly practicing, but to say that my faith gets complicated from there is understating it. Now, one thing I'm quite certain of is that my faith is my business, and nobody else's. And if religion operated on that level, on a broader scale, I got the feeling that we as a society would be much better off. And yet, unsurprisingly, there's a whole subsection of the music industry devoted to music with very strong Christian themes. A subsection in the industry that tends to get relentlessly snubbed, panned, or outright ignored by critics. And to some extent, that's not a good thing. When you shut down the critical discourse and the artistic conversation, art developed in that environment tends to develop insular tendencies, without the slightest element of real quality control. But to be fair to myself and other critics, it's not like we don't have good reasons for ignoring that particular subsection of music. Putting aside the issue that certain elements of the fandom will immediately perceive criticism of the music as criticism of not just the artist, but of the religion as well, the production and the instrumentation is often substandard, in some cases outright derivative of other non-religious acts, because they can get away with it. And lyrically, look, religion has inspired some fantastic artists to write classic songs. Johnny Cash, Tom Waits, Nick Cave, the list could easily go on. But in that particular subgenre, you can fall into two distinctive traps. The first is being that much of the material is not willing to directly comment upon or criticize the faith that underlies it, which can lead to a real serious lack of drama. After all, if the answer can always be provided by Deus Ex Machina, you really undercut the tension, which tend to lead a lot of the music coming across at best placid and unthreatening, and at worst just aggravatingly self-satisfied. And the second major problem is evangelicalism. Now look, for a critic, it can get exasperating when the music's sole purpose is to preach or go political in a way that really does lack nuance, especially when a lot of their answers and explanations loop back to a holy book that should be read allegorically and metaphorically rather than literally. But look, what all this means is that with rare occasion, most Christian music never gets play on the mainstream radio or on the pop charts, and everybody tends to be pretty much okay with that. But at the same time, it's been a generally accepted rule that many songs are outright anti-religion don't tend to get a lot of airplay either. Because let's face it, spitting in the face of people's faith without a certain degree of nuance, that's just as exasperating, can be pretty insulting, honestly. So you can bet that I was very surprised to see a song titled "Take Me to Church" creeping up the lower half of the charts. A song fairly blunt in its losing my religion metaphors when linking back to this complicated relationship. Now let me stress, this is a strong way to immediately grab my attention as a critic. Strong single, intriguing content, doing something new and sounding different. So I decided to go check out his self-titled debut album. What'd I find? Well, I definitely was not expecting this. Granted, Take Me to Church was the sort of intricate song driven by visceral poetry that meant I didn't know what to expect, but Hozier's self-titled debut album was a really welcome surprise. Drenched in old school, grimy, blues rock and soul, and even gospel, and wearing its love for Tom Waits very proudly, which is a little bit uncanny coming from an Irish singer-songwriter. It's an attraction to traditionally American music and culture that recalls a lot of Nick Cave's cultural fascination with westerns, gospel, and southern gothic iconography. And if you know me, and I'm talking about comparisons to Nick Cave, we're talking about an act with serious talent. Make no mistake, Hozier is the sort of act that immediately pushes a lot of great buttons with me. Sonic callbacks to organically textured old school genres, and yet brought up to date with songwriting with very modern framing. Oh, if you can't tell, the album's awesome. It's the sort of dark, bluesy grime that isn't afraid to go into the black recesses of human passion and claw out something real and powerful, and something that most people would shy away from admitting that they have deep down. So let's start with Hozier himself, and let me stress that he's the sort of singer that immediately grips me as a vocalist. A rich low and mid-range, unafraid to break into a full-throated howl when necessary to amp up to the visceral emotion. Yeah, pretty much many of the words I use to describe a lot of Nick Cave's vocals. But that's where the comparisons will end. Where Nick Cave's vocals, they're more raw, influenced by a lot of punk and post-punk. Hozier has this air of shattered, hastily reassembled dignity brought upon by soul-bearing vulnerability and the pure desperation of youth. Almost reminiscent of James Blake, but with a much deeper brand of tarnished soul. If there's any slickness or polish to its delivery, it's an old school veneer that's plainly transparent, or viciously subverted by the song in question, like on From Eden, where he quite literally frames himself as the snake in the Garden of Eden. It's the sort of voice that lends itself naturally to tortured or at least complicated framing, to the point where the otherwise gorgeous In a Week featuring Karen Cowley's perfect matching alto, can't help but feel a little bit underweight in its emotional stakes, even though it's a love song between two corpses. Now, I'm a little bit more mixed on some of the vocal effects. There are definitely moments where the reverb is a little too heavy, but it often completely fits with the atmosphere, and I'm a complete sucker for a well-executed gospel choir, which comes up a number of times on the album, especially surrounding darker subject matter. When you have a gospel choir, you're subverting it by going dark. Now, this takes us to the instrumentation and the production, and if I were to have any larger issues with the album, it'd probably come here. Much of the album feels cavernous and deep, and somewhat indebted to Jack White's most recent album, Lazaretto, drenched in the sort of textures that I just love in this brand of blues and soul, or even elements of alternative country. And thus, whenever he drifts a little bit closer to the lighter, more acoustic textures of folk music, it just feels a little out of place to me. Not that it's bad, mind you. He's got a deft touch for lyricism and framing that makes him a natural fit for folk music, and I love how he brings in backing vocals and subtle musical flourishes, like how you can hear the birds outside the collapsed hotel where he recorded Cherry Wine. But I gotta admit, it lacks a little bit of the old school character and flair that makes Hozier's debut so powerfully memorable and unique. And what I love is that the instrumental characters could have so easily succumbed to the heavy percussion and reverb-laden production that's so popular and easy right now. And yet, Hozier makes the right choice by bringing the melody straight to the forefront, letting the bass and the guitars growl with great texture. The low piano keys intensify that darkness, and then the organ adding that perfect accent to the pieces. And while the gothic intensity of Take Me to Church, that's powerful, probably not even the best song on this album. The lonely blues spike of Angel of Small Death and the codeine scene that breaks into the sizzling solo, the rollicking rhythm and blues guitar with Jackie Wilson complete with backing chorus that just sounds great, the elegant upright bass and overall old school romantic vibe of Someone New that completely bellies and subverts the sleazy vibe of that song, the great smoky noir guitar lick on To Be Alone with explosively punchy drums, and that great rising swell during the pre-chorus I really loved, the organ and fantastic Spanish guitar interlude on From Eden, the achingly slow heaviness of Work Song with the hollow percussion that really stood out, the ominous piano and drums balancing against the mournful strings on Foreigner's God, and okay, it's me, of course, the thick, borderline country guitar snarl, I Will Come Back, that just works for me. Now, if I were to take the smallest issue with the production, is that the guitars could have had just a little bit more bite to them to match the organ and the backing vocals for their texture. But really, considering how well this album evokes that old school sound and yet makes it feel so incredibly modern and fresh, that's a small complaint indeed. And this takes us to the lyrics. And if you're gonna take anything away from this debut album, the lyrics will be it, because Hozier makes a stark, vivid, powerful impact here. Not only is his writing completely sound from a technical side, it delves into the visceral, striking wordplay that might shock some people on first listen for its rawness, but it completely fits on this album. This is an album draped in corroded religious iconography and metaphors, and Noir's grim acceptance of death but that will nevertheless draw howls as he rages going into that good night. And considering that he uses most of this iconography as symbols for relationships, it's quite easy to think of this as hyperbolic or overwrought. Hell, Take Me to Church describes an imbalance in power in relationships and describes it with the undercurrents of Catholic guilt, with the girl representing his goddess in question. And yet Hozier is smart enough to frame his choices as being made for love, and it highlights the very explicit parallel you can make between his love and the faith that is often present in religious figures. Two implacable emotions that ultimately will defy higher reason. That might as well be the biggest theme of this album, delving into the psychology of why people crave relationships that become power struggles or stay with partners who abuse or neglect them. And Hozier's got two secret weapons on his side. The first being perfect framing, that he's not afraid to show both partners as equally despicable, and the second being unflinching, painful honesty. And to his credit, he creates a number of very vivid situations to explore and examine these themes. The one night stand of Angel of Small Death in the codeine scene, where he wanders alone in the streets after sex and wonders why he even got involved. Someone New inverts the relationship and places him in the role of a serial womanizer who always craves someone new and is never satisfied and will never be satisfied. To Be Alone is a track unafraid to highlight its own hypocrisy, as he sings about leaving the club scene and its references to rape culture with a depressed girl, who he then exploits as she recoils at his touch. Hell, From Eden casts him as a Satan figure outright for pursuing his desires. And the mirrored tracks Work Song and Like Real People Do finds Hozier pledging his love, saying that if buried, he will still claw his way out of the dirt for this girl. And then he raises the point that she wouldn't be digging in the dark if she wasn't just like him in her own way. It's very telling the most joyous or contented relationship songs on this album are either a wistful fantasy on Jackie and Wilson, or when both lovers are dead on In a Week. When Hozier is singing about real love on this album, it's a sort that wrenches the worst possible instincts of both partners forward, showing how they both have the capacity to do terrible things to each other simply through the mutual vulnerability that they share, all done in the name of love. And it makes complete sense, really, especially when placed in stark parallel with faith and religion, which asks a person to bare his or her soul to a higher power for judgment, another force for which people will do terrible things to other people. And the omnipresent question across this album is whether or not it's all worth it. And that's why I love the inclusion of Sedated and Cherry Wine on this album. Neither are songs that I would consider all that great, but they highlight the heady feeling of human nature's addiction to those feelings and how they're willing to go through all of the pain that the lovers will inflict upon them all the same, even despite all of it, because that love, that feeling of fulfillment, that passion is that potent. Now, let me be blunt here. Thematically, that's a tough theme to really anchor a record, to make it work, because you're making the assumption that the music can convey that sort of attraction. And I guarantee that there will be a lot of listeners that will not be the case for this album. They'll find the relationships melodramatic and overwrought, the religious iconography lacking in real weight, the blues, soul, and gospel elements on old-fashioned cover for something that's not really there. But then again, this is an old-fashioned record, both in sound and themes. The starkly sketched morals, the callbacks to noir, the emphasis on emotion and passion over reason from the human animal. These aren't exactly modern notions, and yet, like St. Vincent's self-titled album, Hozier's self-titled record highlights that backward step as yet a very quintessentially human step. And then it occasionally gives it the real emotional stakes that often St. Vincent's self-titled album occasionally lacked. In other words, this album's fantastic. A gripping, intensely textured and written album that is a jaw-dropping debut that gets a 9 out of 10 for me and the highest of recommendations. Yeah, some of it might appeal to my own complicated religious feelings more than most, but that doesn't mean that this album is not amazing. Seriously, guys, go check out Hozier's self-titled debut. You won't regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation or any other albums coming out that you want me to cover, I'd be more than happy to hear about it. If you got other feelings about this album that I haven't mentioned, please mention in the comments. I'd be happy to hear how you feel on this sort of thing. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.